Chapter 28, Ordeal. They didn't have to wait long. 30 minutes later, Ruby heard the sound of voices coming down the hallway and perked up. Some of them are getting close, Ruby said. I think they're coming back from somewhere. Diane nodded, while Cynthia clutched her chains even tighter. Jessica looked a little sick, holding her long shards of wood. They could hear the pirates loudly talking through the door now, boasting about what they would do to the girls in the room. I think I'm going to throw up, Jessica said. Ruby elbowed her. Shish. The door creaked open, the hallway lights spilling inside. One of pirates eagerly walked in, looking around for the girls. Cynthia's chain hit his face and his head deformed, a sickening cracking as his brains were spread all over the wall. The fuck? One of his companions exclaimed, running in. He met a similar fate as Cynthia swung again, smashing the other chain into his head and knocking him to the floor. And then two more ran in, firing weapons, forcing Cynthia to swing the chains back and block the dust bullets. Ruby leapt forward out of the bathroom with Diane, both of them slamming pieces of wood into the parade's necks and chests. That's four, Diane said, grinning. They dragged the bodies into the room, shutting the door again. Ruby pulled jagged pieces of wood back out and handed them to Diane, taking up positions at the entrance. A few more footsteps lined up outside of the door. Hey, you guys okay in there? Came a voice. Say something, or else we're coming in. The door suddenly broke down, a large ram faunus charging his way through. Cynthia was caught by surprise as the door slammed into her, sending her flying across the room and slamming into one of the windows, her arms and legs bending awkwardly underneath her. An avian faunus and a wolf faunus burst in, following the ram and engaging Diane and Ruby. Jessica stood in the back of the bathroom, unsure of what to do as they started fighting. The two faunus had rifles that doubled as batons, swinging and firing alternatively. Diane spun her pieces of wood, deflecting the batons and the bullets, but the wood was fragile and shattered into pieces as wolf faunus continued firing. Ruby had engaged the avian faunus, recognizing him by the colors of the feathers in his hair as the one who had exploded a dust crystal on her. Instead of deflecting the baton, she slammed her shoulder into him, ignoring the frantic hits against her back, and grabbed his arm, ripping it off with her good hand. She threw the limb at the wolf faunus Diane was fighting, the massive flash hitting his head. He stumbled a bit, and Diane slammed the shard of wood into his heart. Looking back at the screaming avian underneath her, she took a cue from Ren and slammed her palm into his throat at an angle, ripping through the flesh and shattering his neck bones, his head flying off and bouncing against the wall. Jessica screamed. Ruby looked up, seeing Cynthia desperately trying to defend as the ram faunus slammed the door into her repeatedly. Jessica, go help her. Ruby shouted, grabbing Jessica and throwing her at the ram faunus. Jessica stumbled, but turned her momentum into a spinning kick and slammed her foot into the ram's shin. He howled, letting go of the door and clutching his foot. Cynthia rolled out from under the door and snapped out her chain, wrapping it around his ankle and pulling. The ram faunus slipped and fell forward, where Jessica slammed one of her stakes into his eye. The ram stopped screaming. Ah, was all Jessica could say before she went to the corner and threw up. Ruby walked over to her, patting her on the back. Great job, Jessica, she said, smiling. Diane helped Cynthia up, complimenting her on her skill with the chains. Cynthia gave her a shaky grin. And that's 7 down, Diane said, picking up the batons and handing one to Ruby. This is going better than I expected. They searched the faunus pockets, taking out small clips of ammo that they reloaded into the batons and putting the rest into their own pockets. Get ready, Ruby said, her ears perking up. I think they heard us. Sounds of running boots came down the hallway, and a fox-eared faunus appeared in the doorway. Ruby and Diane instantly shot him in the face, and he stumbled and fell to his knees, collapsing face down on the floor. Oh. So the little ladies killed some of my soldiers, huh? The bear faunus stepped into the doorway, and Ruby and Diane opened fire. His pale yellow aura flared around him, the dust bullets merely making him grunt. I think you should stop resisting, before anything really bad happens, he said, slowly moving forward. Before Ruby could rush him, his arm guard suddenly expanded, forming a gigantic shield that slammed into the ground and almost completely sealed the entire hallway. He continued to advance, the bullets harmlessly bouncing off of the shield. Pirates began to fill the space behind him as the four of them backed up into the living area, unable to damage the shield. RWBY ran forward and tried pushing against it, but it only paused for a second before RWBY was forced to take a step back. And then the shield refolded and 8 pirates stood behind the bear, crammed into the room, leveling rifles and grenade launchers at them. "Stand down," the bear said. "I can take care of this." RWBY and Diane charged together, stopping right before him and bringing the batons down towards his head. Moving faster than a man of his bulk should be able to, he ducked down and expanded his shield again, slamming it into the two and crushing them into the wall, the gigantic shield completely pinning them down. The pressure let up for a second, then the bear fauna slammed the shield down again, repeating the process a few more times until Diane fell to the floor, unconscious from the blows, and RWBY collapsed to her knees, head spinning and unable to stand. Cynthia and Jessica stood in the corner of the room, Cynthia's chains spinning around them, but the moment the bear retracted his shield and started walking towards them, they dropped their weapons and raised their hands in the air. "Good girls. I might even let you two live," he said, walking to the wall and pulling out another set of collars from his pockets. Taking one end of the collar, he bent the chokers into hooks, slamming them into the metal wall and giving the chains a tug to make sure they were secure. He walked back to the girls, effortlessly picking them up and latching the collars around their necks, setting them down on the floor. He repeated the process for the limp RWBY and the unconscious Diane. "No food rations for you," the bear fauna said, snapping the collar into place around RWBY's neck. He dusted his hands off, surveying his handiwork, then turned and addressed the pirates behind him. "I'm done with them. You guys can go have some fun now," he said, shouldering past the pirates and leaving the room. The pirates fell upon them like rabid animals. Jessica and Cynthia cried out but didn't resist, their protests replaced with sloppy wet sounds. Diane was shaken awake and assaulted, half-dazed as they tore off her clothes. 2 of the pirates approached RWBY, one of them grabbing her head and shoving his face at hers. RWBY pretended to stay limp, his tongue probing into her mouth, then bit down, ripping off the fleshy muscle. He screamed and jerked back, exposing his throat, and RWBY lunged forward, catching his jaw with her sharp teeth and tearing out the bone. The pirate stumbled back, clutching the gushing hole where his mouth used to be. The other pirate backed off a bit, pulling out pistol and firing wildly at her. The dust bullets caught her in the chest and neck as RWBY tried to dodge the gun, limited by the chains. She fell back, coughing blood and slumping against the wall, her vision flickering and red blooming across her shirt. The Faunus pirate dragged his companion out of the room, bloody hands still clutched around his throat. The other pirates had seen what happened and stayed away from her, despite the bullet wounds in her torso. RWBY faded out of consciousness, the sounds of grunts and crying ringing in her ears as the darkness overtook her. The room was quiet when she woke up, the moon already low in the sky. She had mostly slept through the entire day, waking up in short flashes and lashing out whenever someone tried to touch her. She vaguely remembered the bear coming back into the room and laughing at her, telling the pirates to stay away from her and let her starve to death as a lesson to anyone who might try to resist. The bullet wounds in her chest and neck had mostly closed up, and her elbow felt almost fine. RWBY was hungry and tired and thirsty, the whole day having passed without getting anything to eat. She looked around the room, her heart tightening a bit as she saw the other 3. They were in various states of undress, bruises covering them, their hair matted and their bodies dirty. All of them were asleep, exhausted. RWBY tugged at the collar around her neck, then pulled on the chain as hard as she could. The metal hook was firmly embedded into the wall, RWBY only able to pull it out an inch or so before giving up, panting, her arms sore. Looked down at her splint, she flexed her arm out, the wood splintering and breaking, and shook off the scraps of cloth still around her arm and shoulder. Now able to use both of her arms, she carefully pulled the metal, slowly taking it out of the wall, then carried it with her as she went to the bathroom and turned on the faucet. She took a long drink, then went back to the wall, pushing the hook back in and leaning against metal surface. Half an hour later, another group of pirates arrived, smelling like food. They woke the 3 girls, setting down bowls of stew in front of them. The 3 ate ravenously as the soldiers laughed, forced to slurp from the bowl and use their hands. Ruby tried to ignore her growling stomach as she watched them eat, the smell of the stew wafting through the air. After the girls were done, the pirates unchained them and dragged them to the bathroom. Ruby heard moans and grunts again, then the showers were turned on. A few minutes later, they were let out again, having been forcibly cleaned and scrubbed, and chained back to the wall. The bowls were taken away, and the pirates left the room. A few minutes later, they came back with a door, the previous one having been broken down, and screwed the hinges into the wall and slammed the door shut, locking it. Once Ruby was sure they were alone, she spoke up. "I couldn't protect you guys," Ruby whispered sorrowfully. "Sorry." Diane's ears twitched and she turned to look at her. "You're still alive?" Diane asked incredulously. "Your heartbeat was so faint that even I couldn't hear it." "Red," Jessica whispered. "At least you tried. I don't blame you." Cynthia was silently crying. "I don't blame you either," she sniffled. Ruby smiled a little, murmuring a thanks. She looked up at the moon, the glow softly illuminating the room. None of them moved to turn on the lights, instead choosing to remain in darkness. "We said we would escape or die fighting," Diane suddenly said. "But we're not dead, are we?" Ruby thought for a moment. "I can give you all an option," she said slowly. "If you don't want to continue suffering, I can end your pain, right now." They paused for a moment, thinking. "You'd kill us if we asked you to?" Diane asked, realizing what she meant. "Yes," Ruby said quietly. "I can get out of these chains, and I'll just snap your necks at the base of your skulls. It'll be painless, I promise." Now face to face with the guaranteed possibility of death, the three hesitated. "Can we wait until morning?" Jessica asked, frightened. "I don't think I can make the decision right now," she cried, beginning to sob. "Shish, I didn't mean to scare you," Ruby said, trying to comfort her. "It's just an option. I'm letting you guys know that there's always a way out." Cynthia spoke up. "They're starving you," she pointed out. "Will you still have the strength to do this in a few more days?" Ruby shrugged. "We'll see, but if it gets to the point where I can't get these chains out of the wall, then yes, I won't be able to do anything. As long as I'm alive, I'll be able to fight," Diane decided. "Dying will get me nowhere." Ruby nodded. "When the time is right, I'll fight with you too." "I don't want to die pointlessly either," Cynthia said, "but what if we're captured again? And then they do even worse things to us." "Is that your decision?" Ruby asked, standing up. Cynthia scrambled back, shaking her head, her eyes wide open. "And no, I'm just giving my opinion." Ruby sat back down. "Then let's get some rest. We'll wait for an opportunity." The four didn't speak, thinking their own thoughts, and eventually fell asleep. The days passed like that, pirates coming in every day to have their way with the prisoners, disregarding Ruby and letting her starve. Cynthia and Jessica were unwilling to take up her offer. Ruby was forced to permanently loosen her hook from the wall, hoping that no one would check, as she grew too weak to pull it out. She also loosened the hooks for the other three girls, knowing that she wouldn't be able to do it in the future. The pirates watched over them as food was served, rendering the three unable to hide food for Ruby. She had to sneak into the bathroom for water, drinking from the tap, to prevent an early death from dehydration. Ruby sat there every day, listening to the sounds of the pirates abusing the other three, and at night she discussed with Diane when they could escape. Cynthia and Jessica grew comatose, becoming silent and unspeaking. They hid in their own minds, unwilling to confront the outside world. Only Diane continued to fight, continued to hold on to her personality. Ruby grew thinner and thinner, her arms and legs becoming bony sticks, her cheeks gaunt and her eyes hollow, her legs barely able to support her during her trips to the faucet. When the pirates were there during the day, Ruby paid attention to their conversations, hearing complaints and rumors about darkening skies and growing waves. The atmosphere of the ship grew grimmer as Ruby heard thunderstorms every day, pirates muttering about black rain. Diane told her that this type of weather hadn't occurred before during previous trips. The four of them woke up one night when the boat rocked, something huge slamming into the hull. Looking out of the windows, they saw a gigantic black mass rising upwards, crawling onto the ship. The sounds of screaming and yelling came from outside the room, pirates panicking and people shouting orders. There was a huge explosion, and the gigantic creature fell back into the ocean, a gaping hole blown into it. As the monster fell back and retreated, undulating away, Ruby saw that it looked like a massive black king taijutsu, swimming beneath the waves. And then the boat shook again, a glimpse of something white appearing in the windows as another snake crawled onto the ship, squirming masses of small snakes crawling on its back. Another huge explosion came, along with sounds of gunfire. Ruby heard pirates running down the hallway, opening doors and slamming them shut. The entrance to their own room opened up and two pirates stumbled inside, bleeding from multiple bite wounds and shouldering the door closed. There were still a few snakes attached to them, so the wolf faunus and the goat faunus ripped the snakes off and stomped on them. Ruby glanced at Diane, and she nodded. The pirates slumped to the floor, gasping, and Diane moved. Ripping the loose hook out of the wall, she jumped forward and slammed it into one of the pirates' head. The other pirate looked up, shocked, and began shouting, but Ruby had flared the last vestiges of her aura and freed herself too, stumbling forward and crushing the surprised pirate's head against the wall. He slumped down, unconscious, as Ruby collapsed onto him and panted, breathing in his warm smell. Jessica and Cynthia hadn't reacted the whole time, staring at the two with glassy eyes. Ruby's stomach growled and her body ached. She had stifled her needs for weeks, and now her hunger consumed her mind, ravenous from the starvation she had suffered. Ruby felt her control slipping. "Diane, look away," she pleaded, tears coming to her eyes. Diane could only stare in horror as Ruby ripped into the unconscious faunus, clawing at his midsection and cracking his ribs, scooping out his heart and liver and shoving it into her mouth. As she ate, the kidneys were exposed, and she ripped them out too, eating them in 2 bites. Her sharp teeth easily chewing through the organs. The cat faunus stumbled back, retching, as she moved away from the bloodshed. She huddled in the corner, shivering, with nowhere to go, as Ruby systematically ate the internal organs, her body demanding the nutrients. A few minutes later, Ruby felt her senses return, her hunger satisfied. Her face bloody, her hair matted with fluids, she looked up, seeing the 3 people staring at her in horror. Unbidden, tears formed in her eyes again, trickling down her face as she broke down and sobbed. She had tried so hard to suppress her emotions, she had resisted for all those weeks, becoming someone who didn't murder and eat people, but now her facade had collapsed once more, her nature getting the better of her. She wanted to throw up the meat, reject what she had done, but her body wouldn't let her. Ruby was still weak, muscles trembling, but she angrily picked up the mangled corpse and threw it into the bathtub, then sat back down and continued weeping. "I didn't want to eat him," Ruby wailed, "but I was so hungry." She looked towards Diane, hoping to find a shred of understanding, but Diane impulsively looked away, unwilling to meet those piercing gray eyes. Jessica and Cynthia were still dazed, but deep down inside them they recognized what they were seeing and were afraid, their bodies trembling. Ruby felt like giving up, felt like opening the door and letting snakes come in and kill all of them. But she still cared for Jessica, and she still wanted to protect these people she had promised to save, so she stood up, wiping away her tears and stifling her sniffles. Moving to the bathroom, her arms shook as she washed the blood off of herself, looking at herself in the mirror. She still looked like a living skeleton, her chest nearly flat and her cheekbones at sharp angles, but she felt her body filling back up, quickly burning the food in her stomach. She walked back into the room and opened up the closet, searching for some clothes. Picking out 4 pairs of sweatpants and shirts, she threw a pair to Diane, who instinctively caught them. Ruby stripped off her bloody and tattered clothing, putting on a fresh black t-shirt and gray sweatpants, rolling up the bottom of the legs and pulling the cords tight against her thin waist. "Let's get them dressed," Ruby said quietly. Diane stood up, flinching a little as Ruby started walking towards her, but she steeled herself, holding Jessica and Cynthia up under their arms as Ruby slipped the pants and shirts onto them. After a bit of coaxing, they stood up robotically, a bit of life coming back into their eyes. Ruby opened the door and peeked out, getting a glimpse of dozens of dead pirates being swarmed by innumerable amounts of squirming white taijudas and then immediately slamming the door shut when 2 of them tried to crawl inside. "I think most of the pirates are dead, there are a lot of bodies outside," Ruby told Diane. "What do you want to do?" Diane cleared her throat. I think we should wait a while in here first. Let Jessica and Cynthia come back to their senses. Maybe the snakes will clear up too. Ruby nodded, bending down and pulling the weapons off of the pirate's body before dragging it into the bathroom, putting it into the bathtub. Shifting the bodies around, she took the other weapons from the body she had eaten earlier, trying not to look at the exposed entrails. Her stomach was already beginning to feel a little empty, and she knew her hunger would return soon. The two soldiers had rifles on them, along with 6 clips of ammo and 3 knives. She handed a rifle and 3 clips to Diane. Moving to Jessica and Cynthia, the two sat together with them, murmuring softly and telling them they were safe, trying to wake them. An hour later, Jessica was beginning to stir herself. "Are Red?" she asked, blinking. "What's going on?" "You're safe, most of the pirates are dead, and there are tons of snake grim swarming the hallways," Ruby explained, having no desire to mention what she had done if Jessica didn't remember anything. Cynthia also didn't seem to remember as she broke free of her state. She shook her head, clearing away the mental cobwebs. "Wah, is it over now?" Ruby nodded. "I don't think I remember anything that happened," Cynthia said. "It felt like I was drowning in quicksand, trapped in my own mind." Jessica nodded. "I'll probably have a ton of repressed memories to deal with when I get back, but I feel okay right now, with you two here." Jessica looked closer, noticing Ruby's appearance. "Red, what happened to you?" she gasped. "You look like the living dead." Ruby grimly chuckled. "That's what weeks of starvation'll do to you," she responded, rubbing her thin arms. "So what do we do now, Red?" Cynthia asked. "We wait for a little bit," Ruby said. "Stretch out your body, get ready. We're going to try to retake the ship, now that so many of the pirates are dead." A few minutes later, they were ready to go. Cynthia had her chains and a knife, and Ruby and Diane each had a length of metal wrapped around their arms. Jessica was given the other 2 knives. "As long as we don't see enemies, we focus on the snakes at our feet, alright?" Ruby said. "Keep the area around ourselves clear and avoid being bitten." The 3 nodded in agreement. Taking a breath, Ruby pushed open the door. Chapter 29, Docking. The snakes were still in the hallways, but the number had lessened, most squirming above deck and dropping back into the ocean after not being able to find anything else to attack. The 4 of them cautiously advanced, stomping and stabbing the snakes at their feet. A few of them reared up and jumped, attacking from all angles. A particularly large one wrapped itself around Jessica, striking at her face, but Cynthia swung her chain and wrapped it around the snake's head, pulling it back. Diane sliced its head off in a blur, the knife gleaming and the grim falling loose. Walking past the dead bodies, Ruby saw that they were completely bloody, every inch of exposed skin torn, the armored helmets and chest plates they wore dented and filled with holes. Judging by the blood-stained walls of the hallway, the snakes had swarmed in as a mass, half a foot of bodies filling the floor, and managed to swamp the Faunus pirates. Ruby kicked a particularly large ram Faunus, to make sure he was dead, and his fist suddenly reached out, grabbing her ankle and pulling her to the ground. Ruby gave out an involuntary squeak, then slammed the knife into the back of the ram's head, and he let go of her ankle. "Are you okay?" Jessica asked, eyes wide. Ruby nodded, catching her breath as she sliced a snake that had been jumping at her in half. "My room first," Ruby whispered. "I have to get something." They nodded and moved towards Ruby's room, the 3rd door down the hallway. Barging in, they found 2 sailors chained to the wall, looking terrified. Ruby recognized one of them as Derek. They relaxed upon seeing the girls, opening their mouths, but Ruby shushed them, opening the closet. Unzipping her travel bag, she took out her scythe and 5 clips of heavy-duty ammo. Ruby handed her pistol to Derek, giving the chain around her arm to the other man as she stood up, unfolding the scythe. They gaped at her as the massive scythe opened, the gleaming black and red metal making for an intimidating sight. Ruby looked it over, stroking it and making sure that it was functioning perfectly. One of sailors stared, looking not at the weapon but at Ruby, understanding coming into his eyes. "Red, you're alive," Derek began. "Do you guys know where their leader is?" she interrupted, refolding her scythe and slipping it into their waistband. "Yeah, he's taken up residence in the dining hall," Derek said, confused. Ruby looked at her three companions. "Let's go take out the leader," she said. "And then we can rescue the other prisoners." They agreed with her and the group ran towards the dining hall, Ruby slicing the snakes around them to bits. The dining hall's doors were closed. Ruby sliced them diagonally and slammed through, hoping to surprise anyone on the other side. Two startled Faunus looked up, shocked, and Cynthia and Diane engaged them, Jessica tentatively following behind the two. Another Faunus rushed towards them, awoken by the commotion, and the two sailors turned to fight him, attacking him with their makeshift weapons. Ruby ran forward, focused on the figure that was reclining on a chair at the center tables. The bear Faunus finally sat up, noticing the commotion, and glared at her. "Back for another round, girly," he rumbled, standing back up. Ruby grinned, baring her teeth. "I've got my weapon now," she stated, slamming her side into the floor. The bear started walking towards her, slowly and deliberately. Ruby fired her heavy-duty rounds, but his shield instantly came up, glowing with pale yellow aura, the dust bullets exploding against it but not damaging it. The bear was getting closer, and the bullets weren't working, so Ruby plucked her scythe out of the floor, whirling in a circle and slamming it into the bear's shield. He gave a roar of surprise as Ruby's scythe pierced it, the tip slicing into his arm. Using brute force, he swung his shield, flinging Ruby into a table. Ruby's frail bones cracked a little, but she stood back up and shifted the scythe back into the shotgun mode, taking aim and firing. The bear charged her, shield out in front of him. Ruby jumped over his head and fired, one of the bullets slamming into his shoulder and making him stumble. His aura protected him, but the dust bullet's explosion still staggered him. Ruby landed near him, swinging her scythe even as she unfolded it, taking advantage of his momentary distraction. The bear was barely able to raise his shield in time, Ruby's blade glancing off the edges as she danced and swirled. And then a golden shockwave flew out, slamming into Ruby and sending her careening against the floor. The bear roared in laughter. "Didn't see that coming, did you?" he shouted, running at her. Ruby was stunned, barely managed to roll to the side as the shield slammed into where she had been, the floor cracking and another shockwave flying outwards and pushing Ruby, sending her skidding into the wall. Ruby lay there, concussed, as the bear ran towards her to finish her off, when a shouting Derek suddenly slammed into the bear Faunus from behind, swinging a metal baton into his head and interrupting his charge. The bear Faunus growled, shrugging off the blow and grabbing Derek, flinging him across the room and into the wall. He slid down, unmoving. "Derek!" Ruby cried, standing back up. "Oh. So you like him?" the bear said, grinning. "That's a shame." Ruby screamed, seeing another loved one being ripped out of her life by outside forces. Her vision went red and her aura suddenly flared out, a dark red maelstrom surrounding her. In a swirl of rose petals, Ruby disappeared and reappeared right next to the bear. He shouted in surprise, his aura exploding outwards in a concussive wave again, but Ruby barely stumbled, moving herself forward and smashing her palm into his chest. This time the bear flew back, landing on a table and shattering it, his aura cracking and beginning to fade. He immediately struggled to stand back up, but in another swirl of rose petals Ruby was on him, swinging her scythe and slicing off his leg off at the knee. The bear Faunus roared from the pain and swung his shield, catching Ruby in the stomach, and exploded his aura. The point-blank concussion rippled through Ruby, her midsection exploding in a shower of blood and fluids, her organs bursting out. Ruby toppled down next to him, her body going into shock. The bear roared again, rolling over and slamming the shield back down onto her. Ruby raised an arm to block, the shield blast shattering her fragile bones, and took the opportunity to shove the scythe's muzzle into his chest, firing, the dust bullets penetrating his weakened aura. The Faunus looked surprised as blood bubbled from his mouth, but he still swung his shield again. Ruby knocked it aside with her scythe, the Faunus weakened, and sliced off his arm, kicking the shield to the away. The bear started backing up, the stump of his knee dragging on the floor, but Ruby swung her scythe again, catching him in the gut and sliding her blade through him, coils of intestines spilling out onto the floor, steaming. The bear let out a cry of anguish, frantically trying to shove his guts back in, and Ruby shot him in the head twice. She lay there, gasping, and looked down at herself, seeing her middle a bloody mess, her blood pumping out. Desperate, she scooped as much of the mess as she could back into her abdominal cavity and grabbed the carcass next to her, shoving her arm into the viscera. The red lifeblood flowed into her palm, soaking into her skin, and Ruby shivered as she absorbed it. The muscles and skin healed over her stomach area, the organs slowly beginning to repair themselves underneath. Propping herself up, she looked around and saw Derek staring at her, shocked. Ruby slowly got up on shaky knees, preparing to walk towards him, when he suddenly spoke. "I didn't want to believe it," Derek said slowly. "You were so beautiful and kind when we were together." He gulped nervously. "But that word just confirmed my suspicions. You're Ruby Rose, right? Aren't you wanted for murder?" Ruby's blood turned cold, her legs feeling like blocks of lead. "I thought I recognized her too," the other sailor said. "I can't believe it. Ruby Rose, one of the most wanted criminals in Vale, right under our noses." Ruby felt faint, realizing something. Her past was always catching up with her. No matter what she did, she wouldn't be able to outrun it. Pivoting on a heel, she stalked out of the dining hall. She felt like a robot as she opened up each passenger room, unchaining any prisoners she found and shooting the pirates. Some of them tried to take hostages, but Ruby's heavy-duty rounds left a crater in their heads. The pirates that tossed dust crystals at her had them blown up instantly, Ruby reacting quickly and shooting them before crystals could get near her. Her previous opponents that had outmatched her in physical strength and speed couldn't react as Ruby used the recoil of her scythe to instantly close the distance and slice off their limbs. Of course, some put up a fight, a particularly determined Wolf Faunus giving her trouble. Nimbly wielding a rifle that transitioned into a sword with blades at both ends, he managed to stab Ruby a few times. Ruby shrugged off the injuries and stepped back, firing a few rounds at him, each explosive shot pushing him back into the corner, then pushed herself forward with the recoil of a shot and slammed the scythe down onto his weapon, her dark red aura overwhelming his weak magenta aura and slicing the weapon in half, continuing downwards and cleaving his skull. The last room she entered contained Mark, sitting down in a corner with chains wrapped around him. "Hey," Ruby whispered. "It's over now, the pirates are all dead." Mark jerked up, staring into her eyes. He looked gaunt, his eyes sunken, his clothing hanging loosely off of his body. "Red, is that you?" Ruby nodded, spreading his chains out and slicing them through with her scythe. "Thanks," Mark said gratefully, slowly standing up and rubbing his joints. Ruby gave him a small smile and left the room, heading for the library. Opening up the door, she sat down in a chair, the moon shining down on her, her head on the desk. She didn't have the strength left to cry, she just felt numb. "I knew I'd find you here," Mark said, pulling up a chair and sitting down next to her. Ruby didn't respond, staring forlornly at the desk. "So, I heard you were a murderer," Mark said cautiously. "News travels fast," Ruby sighed. "It's in the past, but yes, I did kill someone that I definitely should not have." "Well, no matter what, I'll always be grateful to you for saving me," Mark said. He looked at her, noting her appearance. "And I see that you've suffered too," he whispered quietly, a compassionate expression on his face. "What did they do to you?" "They didn't give me any food because I fought back," Ruby answered. Mark sucked in a breath. "But Jessica, Cynthia, and Diane suffered much more than me," she continued, leaving words unspoken. Mark nodded, thinking for a while. "The world really isn't fair," he suddenly complained. "Look at you, Red. You've just saved everyone on the ship, and you've suffered greatly for it, yet they're still ostracizing you for a past crime." Mark looked up at the ceiling, letting out his breath. "Did you know that I'm a Faunus?" he asked Ruby. Ruby stared, shocked. Mark smiled and pulled up his sleeves and shirt, exposing a smattering of scales that covered his torso and upper arms. "I'm a snake Faunus," he said. "Sorry I didn't tell you." Ruby thought back to the library, the sunlight always shining through the window at his desk, and his love of sleeping all day. "I should have realized earlier," she said, laughing. Mark continued talking with her for a while more before the captain came into the room, followed by the ragged remains of the crew. "Sorry to disturb you, Red," he said, "but we're going to use this place for a brief meeting because the dining hall is too dirty." Ruby nodded, remembering the mess she had made. The rest of the sailors filed in, all of them injured. Only half of the starting crew was left. Derek was in the group, pointedly avoiding looking at her, so Ruby looked away from him too. The captain stepped forward, turning to address them. "We're going to continue our course and head for the Dragon Wing tip," he stated. "It's the closest landmass, we'll be arriving in a week. Once we get there, I'll understand if you wish to end your contract, and I'll buy airship tickets for those who wish to travel away." All the chefs are okay, as the pirates extensively made use of their services, so we'll be having some food in about an hour and then at normally scheduled times. He paused for a second, suddenly looking years older. "The memorial services will be at 9 tomorrow night," he said. "Everyone should get some rest, it's been long trip." The captain stepped back, done talking. Speech over, Ruby headed towards the exit, but Derek suddenly stood in front of her, at a safe distance of course. Ruby knew what was coming. "I can't be with you anymore," he said bluntly. "Red, Ruby. I don't even know which one is the real you. And after seeing you doing, I don't know what, something, to that bare faunus, He trailed off, unable to say more. Shoulders hunching, Derek walked away from her, out of the room. Ruby leaned back against a book cabinet, shuddering, not really thinking of anything. "Ruby," Jessica asked. "Did he just dump you?" Jessica was standing next to her, an understanding expression on her face. Ruby tearfully nodded. "Are you also going to leave?" she asked, afraid. "No, of course not," Jessica said, giving her a hug. Ruby clutched her tightly and they sank to the floor, embracing each other, Jessica holding Ruby even tighter after feeling how frail she was. They stayed like that for a while. "Ruby. Yeah. I need to go call my parents, they haven't heard from me for weeks." Jessica laughed a bit, wiping her tears. "They probably think I'm dead or something." "Oh crud," Ruby exclaimed, brushing the moisture off of her face. "Yeah, you definitely need to call them." They got up, and Jessica gave her one last hug before turning to leave. "Wait," Ruby said. "Can I ask you something?" Jessica nodded. "How are you dealing with this whole thing?" Ruby inquired. Jessica frowned a little. "Some memories are coming back, little by little," she explained, "but I think I'm mostly okay for now. Now that everything's okay, I can focus on the present and deal with the past." She smiled again and turned, walking away. As Jessica left the library, Ruby wished she could that. Ruby was in her room, lying on the bed and scrolling through her tablet, when someone knocked at the door. "Come in," Ruby said, setting the tablet down and sitting up. Diane walked in, wearing a short-sleeved dress shirt and cargo pants, sitting down on the bed next to Ruby. "Hey," she said. "Hi," Ruby answered cautiously. Diane took a breath, her ears twitching. "I just want you to know, I threw the body off the side of the ship for you. I wrapped it in bedsheets and just chucked it." She made a flinging motion with her arms. Ruby gaped at her. "I don't really care that you, ate him," Diane declared. "The bastard deserved it anyways. As long as you don't eat anyone else, I'll always be your friend." Diane hugged the stunned Ruby. "Thanks for fighting with me." Cynthia appeared in the doorway. "I don't want to interrupt anything," she teased, smiling, "but I was wondering if you wanted to come with us to the memorial services." Ruby shook her head. "No, they all think I'm a terrible murderer. Not saying that they're wrong, but..." Diane sighed. "Yeah, we probably shouldn't rub it into their faces that the person who saved them is a wanted criminal." She looked at Ruby, glancing over her thin body. "How are you doing now?" she asked. "How's your body doing? I don't think you ate anything for weeks." Ruby's stomach growled at the mention of food and she blushed a bit. "I just need to get some food." "That's perfect," Cynthia said, smiling and clapping her hands. "They're serving food right now in the dining hall." "Well, what are waiting for? Let's go," Diane exclaimed, jumping off of the bed. Ruby smiled and followed the two, Diane and Cynthia leading the way. Ruby spent the next week in the weight room, consuming massive quantities of food and building her strength back up. She avoided Derek, and Derek never tried to speak to her. Jessica had called her parents, telling them what had happened, and they were sending a hoverjet to pick her up once they had docked. They arrived at the shore with only one further grim attack, the trained sailors luckily spotting it early and blowing the Sea Grim to bits with the cannons. The dead carcasses of the White King Taijutsu and the little white snakes that were still on board were kept as specimens, to give to the authorities once they had docked. Grim attacks had been growing prolific, and the authorities were scrambling to figure out what was going on. The boat had docked at Dragon Wing and the sailors were given indefinite shore leave, as the captain needed to claim the insurance on the missing cargo and hire new crew members. Out of the remaining crew, 3/4 chose to take up the captain's offer and accept his airship tickets. While Ruby was packing, the captain met with her. Thanking her again for saving the ship, he told her that he managed to convince each crew member to keep their mouths shut, after reminding them of what she had done. Ruby thanked him and surprised him with a hug, telling him that she was sorry that this had happened and hoped he and his company could recover. As Ruby headed off the ship, she observed the city. It was still relatively small, but tall buildings were springing up, some in the process of being built, large hotels and entertainment places being established. The temperature was cool, evidence of the last snowfall piled onto the corners of the sidewalks. Ruby didn't really feel the cold, but she put on a coat anyways, just to keep up appearances. After the 5 of them had rented hotel rooms in the city, the cargo ship needing to be inspected, unloaded, and cleaned, they met in a warm coffee shop, the morning sun shining through the windows. Jessica, Cynthia, Diane, Mark, and Ruby sat in a corner, their little group bonded together after going through the experience on the ship. "My parents are sending a hoverjet to pick me up," Jessica said, taking a sip. "It's going to get here tomorrow. Does anyone need a ride? It's faster than an airship and it's free, too." "I have a family to go back to," Cynthia said, surprising everyone. "It would be great if I could get a lift." Ruby voiced their thoughts. "You don't look, old," Ruby said awkwardly. "Thanks," Cynthia chuckled. "I had my child when I was younger. It wasn't a good decision, but I love my son more than anything else." "I'll be continuing my travels," Mark said, "although I might stay around here a bit longer, to see the sights. I have somewhere I need to go, but I can't tell you guys," Ruby said apologetically. "Sorry. But that was the reason why I came here in the first place." They nodded, drinking in silence. "I don't really know what I'm going to do," Diane confessed, looking a little lost, her ears drooping a little. "You could come with me," Cynthia offered. "Take a break, settle down." The two had become fast friends, and with nowhere else to go, Diane accepted wholeheartedly. They continued talking together, about their lives, their plans, their interests, their goals. The rest of the day was spent walking around the city, checking out the shops and buying trinkets from the popular tourist town. They talked a bit about the odd Grim attacks, wondering what was going on. The night was spent at the hotel, the 5 of them exhausted after their ordeal and an afternoon around the city. They met back at the cargo ship the next morning, the boat now serviceable, and the captain allowed the hoverjet to land on the above-deck platform. The 5 of them gathered there, for one last goodbye. Cynthia gave Ruby her number so they could stay in touch, and Ruby stored it in her tablet and memorized it, also giving Mark and Cynthia her own messaging address. Mark didn't have a number, but he said he would get a tablet as soon as possible. The hoverjet flew off with Cynthia, Diane, and Jessica inside, leaving Mark and Ruby alone on the decks. Giving Mark a nod, Ruby shouldered her backpack and bag and walked off of the ship. Pulling out her tablet, she checked the location of the Faunus village and began walking. Chapter 30, Through the Snow. Before Ruby left the city, she stopped in a public restroom, setting down her pack and opening it up. Carefully unfolding her red and black outfit, she shook it out, checking to make sure it was undamaged. The fabric was made out of thick, thermo-regulating material, tough and resistant. Taking off her outer clothes, she put on the combat skirt, slipping on the thin stockings and stomping on her combat boots. Her red cape was made out of similar material, Ruby securing it around her neck with small metal crosses. Her belt went around her waist, a pouch of ammo on the side. Crouching down, she tied the laces in her boots and stuffed the clothing she had taken off back into her bag, then stepped out of the stall, looking at herself in the mirror. Her body had already fully recovered, her lean muscle back to its previous state. She took a few steps, making her outfit was comfortable. She had completely remade the skirt, using stronger material but keeping the exact same looks, and she was happy with the results. She kept her gun in the bag, the gleaming red and black metal still a little too attention-grabbing. Feeling a bit more like herself again, she put on the backpack and started off towards one of the stores she had passed the previous day. She bought enough canned goods and dried food to completely stuff her backpack, reorganizing the items inside and packing it down. Going through her mental checklist again, she made sure she had everything prepared, checking to make sure the supplies she had bought earlier in Vale were still there. Finally, she was ready to go. She walked to the outskirts of the city, heading inland towards one of the rivers she planned to follow. The outpost was situated near the coast, a river running directly through it. Ruby was going to follow another river for the water source, then hop to the other river and follow that one down directly to the Faunus encampment. The day was bright, the noon sun hanging high above her, but the temperatures were low. This region was cold and often had snowstorms, especially during this time of the year, and the forests were still snowy. After leaving the city, the landscape transitioned into tall, closely packed trees, snow covering the ground. Ruby hiked forward, ignoring the freezing winds and crunching through the snow. Her tablet lost connection to the global communications system, the only thing functioning being the GPS. Checking her tablet intermittently, Ruby made sure that she stayed on course. She estimated that her journey would take quite a while, considering how far the settlement was from other forms of civilization. She knew she couldn't avoid risking drawing attention to it, her criminal status also preventing her from seeking other methods of transportation, so she had to make the journey by foot. It was nighttime when Ruby finally stopped, having traveled 10 miles or so into the wilderness. She chose a clearing, stomping down the snow, and set up a tarp to protect herself and her equipment from the elements. Pulling out a tin of preserved meat, she ate a quick dinner and drank some water from the nearby river. She still wasn't cold, so she just pulled out a sleeping bag and slept inside of it, using it as a barrier to keep her clothing from getting wet. She woke up early the next morning, the sun not yet clearing the horizon, and got up, stretching. Her night in the wilderness seemed to leave her no worse for wear. Packing up the tarp and shouldering her backpack again, she took out her weapon and strapped it to her belt, storing her ammo into the pouch on the side. She was far enough from civilization to not need to worry about laws and regulations any longer. After eating a small packet of dried fruits and nuts, she set out again. The days passed like this, the amount of snow growing higher as Ruby trudged forward. Some nights she sliced up some trees and set up a campfire, eating a hot meal. She was now more than 100 miles from any city, and still far off from her destination. It was getting lonely, the tablet having no way of communicating due to the lack of signal, the snowy landscape becoming monotonous. Some nights Ruby felt an urge to run back to civilization, to go back to where the people were and do something. She hadn't seen a living thing, most of the animals having gone into hibernation, and the silence of the landscape was droning in her ears. The soft snow muffled every step she took, every breath she panted. She grew lost in her daydreams, sometimes forgetting to check her map and going off course. Some nights she sat in the dark, ignoring her need to eat or sleep and instead focusing on the bright stars, wondering if this journey was useless. Her reasoning was beginning to break down, her fragile psyche beginning to fracture. The first grim attack came after 2 weeks of traveling. Ruby was woken up the sounds of growls in the night, alerted right before a beowulf dashed into her tent, jumping on top of her. Ruby nimbly rolled to the side and slipped out of her sleeping bag, pulling out her shotgun and putting a hole through its head. The tarp suddenly collapsed as 2 more beowulfs barreled through the thin walls. Ruby unfolded her scythe and swung in an arc, cleaving off both of their heads. There were a few growls and snuffles, and she heard the rest of the pack retreating. Stepping of her tent, she caught a glimpse of black disappearing into the forest as she looked around her campsite, discovering that the only thing that damaged was the tarp, her backpack untouched. The moon was low in the sky, so Ruby had a quick breakfast and set off again. The next few days were filled with beowulf attacks, the persistent grim returning every few nights and Ruby sometimes managing to kill a few. One night Ruby awoke, having heard the sounds of the beowulfs, and sat up, clutching her scythe. The beowulfs growled and snuffled, but didn't attack. Ruby got up, wondering what was going on, and then something grabbed her shoulders and neck, the strong grip crushing her and forcing her to drop her side, her arms hanging loosely. The talons ripped through the tarp as Ruby was lifted into the air, suddenly gaining an overhead view of the campsite. The beowulfs had been circling around her tent, unwilling to go in. The wind buffeted Ruby's face as she strained to look up, seeing a gigantic black Nevermore holding her aloft, feathers gleaming in the light of the two moons. The Nevermore suddenly shifted its grip, and Ruby felt her shoulders grind and crack, causing her to writhe in discomfort. Ruby was being torn in half, her skin ripping and her muscles attempting to hold themselves together. She felt her joints separate, the tendons ripping apart, and her vision went a little fuzzy. Her arms and legs wouldn't move properly, her body too damaged. Half an hour later, the Nevermore dropped Ruby in a nest, landing on the soft moss bottom. Two Nevermore chicks, each about as large as a man, looked down at her, cocking their heads. Ruby's head was swimming, vision blurry. It was a constant battle to stay conscious, her broken body wanting to shut down. Would I just let them eat me? Ruby asked herself. What's so bad about that? This struggle could be over, I could finally stop fighting. And then one of the chicks pecked her stomach and Ruby instinctively jerked away, managing to roll onto her side. The chick squeaked in fear and flinched back, making the mother Nevermore squawk protectively and flick Ruby with its beak, sending Ruby skidding into the side of the nest, the sticks jabbing into her clothing but not penetrating it. Ruby looked up, seeing that the walls of the nest were higher than her head. Flaring her aura, she forced her body to stand up, ignoring her injuries, and began climbing the nest, using the branches that were sticking out at handholds. The mother Nevermore hissed and Ruby flung herself to another set of branches, narrowly dodging the claw that slammed into the place where she had been. And then its beak slammed into her, shredding her protective clothing and spearing through her chest. The sticks behind her cracked and snapped, sending Ruby flying out of the nest, the mother Nevermore giving a surprised squawk. Ruby slammed into branches on the way down, feeling her bones fracture as she bounced. The tree was high up in the air, so it took a while for Ruby to finally slam into the deep well of snow underneath the evergreen, unable to move. The snow was light and puffy from a recent snowfall, so Ruby sank down a feet or two, eventually coming to a stop as the layers underneath her compressed. Moving her head left and right, Ruby created a small space for herself to breathe in as she listened closely, wondering if the mother Nevermore would search for her. The wound in her chest hardly bled, the freezing temperature making her veins constrict and stop the blood flow. A few minutes later, Ruby had recovered enough to poke herself a little air hole, carefully peeking up at the nest through the branches to see if the mother bird was still there. Apparently gone, Ruby stood up and shook off the snow, pulling the tablet out from her pouch. It was a little cracked, but it still turned on, the bright glow lighting up the snow around her and the branches above her. Checking the map, she found that she was about 15 miles away from her campsite. Deciding to take an aerial route to avoid slogging through the snow, Ruby climbed the nearest tree and began jumping, running across tree limbs and hopping to another one. Avoiding all the snow, Ruby made it back to camp in 2 hours, the moon still high in the sky. The campsite was desolated, the beowulfs apparently having ripped into her supply pack after Ruby had been taken away. Ripped up packets and tins of food were scattered across the ground, the rest of the equipment also strewn around the campsite. Ruby sighed and began looking for the items, ignoring the unsalvageable food. After half an hour Ruby had found her weapon in a snowdrift and a roll of steel silk, the rest of the equipment either torn to shreds or hidden in dark shadows. She wrapped the steel silk around her chest wound, further stemming the bleeding and protecting it from the elements. Deciding to wait until the morning light so she could see better, Ruby climbed into a nearby tree and wrapped her cloak around herself, going to sleep. The next morning she searched for a little longer, finding only 2 tins of beef, 3 rolls of steel silk, a metal canteen, a few sheets of tarp and 2 clips of ammo to complement the 3 clips in her pouch. The rest had either been taken by the beowulfs or hidden underneath the snow, and Ruby didn't feel like bothering to search for them. Her tablet showed that she was still a ways off from her destination, so she set off again, bundling the things she had saved into a piece of tarp and strapping it to her shoulder. At noon she ate one of the tins of meat and drank some water. When the sun set, she found a clearing and sat down, waiting for the Beowulfs to arrive. The growls and snuffles came once more as the bipedal wolves entered the clearing and circled her, preparing to attack. Ruby looked closely at them. One of them was larger than the others, the apparent alpha of the pack. Ruby had been indiscriminately killing them, but now she needed to change it up. This time, she made the first move, jumping at the alpha and plowing into him, both of them flying away from the rest of the wolves. Ruby flipped herself on top of the Beowulf and punched it a few times in the head, stunning it, then turned and whipped out her shotgun, blasting the head off of one of the wolves that was charging her. Predictably, the rest of the wolves retreated again, but this time missing their leader. Ruby turned to the stunned wolf under her and got off, kicking it a few more times to make sure it stayed down. Pulling out a roll of steel silk, she wrapped a strip around the Beowulf's throat, knotting it off and making an immensely strong collar. She used her scythe and sliced off the other end, wrapping it around the thick trunk of a nearby tree. The Beowulf she had shot was still warm, so she drank a bit of its blood before taking out her scythe and slicing it into chunks of meat. The organs she ate immediately, taking her time and licking her fingers clean as she waited for the alpha Beowulf to come back to its senses. The wolf slowly got up, shaking its head and lunging at Ruby. Ruby smacked his snout, sending him flying, the collar choking his neck as it reached the end of the leash. It attacked again, not yet learning its lesson, and Ruby repeatedly smacked it down, sometimes using her scythe to cut it up a little. Blood was flying through the air as Ruby gave it small slices, cutting off a chunk of flesh here and there. It was the first fun thing she had done in a while, and she felt exhilarated, alive once more. Even when the wolf backed up against the tree and whimpered, Ruby followed it, panting in excitement as she removed strips of flesh from its hide. The Beowulf was unconscious when Ruby forced herself to stop, realizing that she needed him alive. She cleaned her scythe off on the snow and reluctantly put it away. Packing some snow around the stakes she had sliced off from the Beowulf to keep them fresh, she climbed the tree and wrapped her cloak around herself, sleeping until morning. She continued traveling the next day, dragging the injured and submissive Beowulf on a leash as she walked. She tried giving it a steak while eating her own meal, but it refused to touch the flesh of its comrade. Ruby shrugged, knowing that it would eventually have to eat or else it would starve to death. The next night, the Beowulf pack came again, but this time to rescue their alpha. Two Beowulfs silently moved in the darkness towards the leashed alpha, unaware that Ruby was watching them from above. The two Beowulfs were gnawing at the steel silk, the tough material resisting their efforts, when Ruby dropped down on top of them, smashing a palm into both of their heads. The two Beowulfs fell, and Ruby spun and gave them both another kick. The alpha had been crouched the whole time, tail tucked underneath him. Ruby wrapped steel silk around their throats and tied them to the tree with the alpha, waiting for them to wake up. After awakening, they once again turned to fight her, and Ruby cut them down repeatedly. The slightly larger Beowulf wouldn't stop attacking even after the other wolf quit, so Ruby sliced off one of its front paws the next time it charged forward. The Beowulf howled and dropped to the ground, clutched its injured forearm, and stopped resisting. Ruby ate a bit more of the flesh she was carrying, once again offering the meat to the alpha and then to the two Beowulfs. None of them touched the meat, instead just shying away from her. The next day she traveled with the three of them in tow, scolding them and prodding them onwards with the pointy end of her scythe when they refused to move. However, they never tried to disobey her again, their injuries reminding them of the consequences of disobedience. 4 nights later, Ruby had collected 7 Beowulfs, and they were starting to get bolder, the presence of their packmates giving them courage. Ruby was running low on food anyways, so she chose one of them and slaughtered it, slicing off all its limbs and giving it a chance to scream before beheading it. The wolves were quiet after that, seeing what Ruby had done. Ruby carved the wolf up, eating the organs and wrapping the rest up in a tarp with a bit of snow. Ruby was a little concerned that her wolves weren't eating anything, so she filled a tarp with water and set it up next to the tree she had tied them to, then put a few stakes next to it. The next morning, the stakes were still there, untouched, so Ruby wrapped them back up and set off again. After a bit more disciplining and some scolding, the Beowulfs completely obeyed her, submitting themselves in fear and tucking their tails whenever Ruby walked towards them. She had decimated the pack of wild Beowulfs, as no more approached her during the night. Now that the Beowulf pack had been subdued, the rest of the wildlife began to appear again, Ruby seeing signs of Ursa tracks in normal animals. One noon during lunch, she climbed up a tree and looking around, catching sight of an Ursa miner snuffling around an evergreen, looking for food. Aiming carefully, she shot it twice in the chest, going for the heart. The Ursa stumbled around a bit and collapsed, blood pooling beneath it. Ruby jumped from tree to tree, landing next to the Ursa and dragging it back to her encampment. The wolves had refused the Beowulf steaks for nearly 2 weeks now, and some of them were growing thin. Ruby set the Ursa down in front of them. "Come on, it's not Beowulf flesh," she encouraged. "Time to eat." The Beowulves inched closer but didn't start eating until Ruby backed away from the corpse. They tore into the flesh ravenously, reminding Ruby of her own hunger. Opening up her tarp, she chewed on a cold steak as she watched them tear into the still warm Ursa. The steak she was eating felt tasteless and dull, so she threw it back into the tarp and walked back towards the Ursa corpse. One of the Beowulves saw her and whimpered, backing off, and the others heard it and also retreated. Ruby smiled, stepping forward and ripping out a warm chunk of flesh, stuffing it into her mouth. The musky, dense, hot Ursa flesh filled her senses as she chewed ravenously, delighted with the fresh meat. Ruby ate for a few minutes, stuffing herself, then let the Beowulves have the rest. Climbing back into her tree, her belly warm and full, she took a small nap as the Beowulves fed. Ruby continued traveling like this, intermittently feeding her 6 Beowulves with whatever wild animal meat she could find, from Ursas to foxes to deer. They were her only company during this time, and Ruby began to grow a little attached, individually recognizing the Beowulves and nicknaming them after the people she had known or killed. The Beowulves had completely submitted to her now, so Ruby slept during the night with them, their warmth comforting her. One morning, however, Ruby woke up to the sight of one of her wolves missing. It had somehow managed to escape, its collar slowly having become loose enough over the few weeks for it to escape. Ruby was a little angry, remembering how she had told them each about the price of disobedience, and checked the remaining Beowulf's collars. Making sure they were secured, she looked around and saw a set of tracks that led away from the campsite. Ruby tried to follow the tracks, but her little experience and the new snowfall obscured them, ending her attempt at tracking only a day after she had begun. Ruby eventually gave up and started heading for the village again, trying to put thoughts of the betrayal out of her mind. The Beowulf came back one bright morning, the barks of the other Beowulves waking Ruby up. There were 2 wolves sitting in front of Ruby as she sat up and yawned. The Beowulf that had escaped had returned with a female Beowulf. "Ah, you wanted to find someone," Ruby gushed as she leaned forward, eyeing the escaped Beowulf. "I'm so glad you came back," she whispered, hugging it. The wolf was panting happily and wagging its tail when Ruby shoved her hand into its stomach. Its legs and arms began to spasm wildly as Ruby kept a firm grip on the Beowulf, pulling out rope after rope of intestine. "Sorry," Ruby said, smiling, "but I told you what would happen if you tried to escape." The Beowulf's legs collapsed as it screamed in pain, trying to wriggle out of Ruby's grasp as she continued to disembowel it. The female howled and leapt at Ruby, but Ruby just kicked it away, sending it slamming into a tree. Half a minute later, the wolf had stopped crying. Ruby stood up, wiping her hands on the snow as she pulled out a roll of steel silk. The female Beowulf was added to Ruby's pack that day, needing to have her tail cut off before she submitted. A few weeks later, after another set of snowstorms and some food shortage issues, Ruby made it to the outpost, her 6 Beowulves behind her.